Did Israel light a spark in Jerusalem's Sheikh Jarrah that Palestinians have transformed into a turning point in their struggle for self-determination? Has the way this conflict is understood internationally really shifted? And if so, what are the political implications? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute interview program on current events, policy questions, and new ideas. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with the writer and analyst Nathan Thrall, who joins us from Jerusalem. Nathan Thrall's work has focused on Israel and Palestine, and he is described as one of the most important writers in the field by the New York Times. He is a contributor to the New York Times Magazine, the London Review of Books, and the New York Review of Books. His widely praised 2018 book, The Only Language They Understand, Forcing Compromise in Israel and Palestine, was translated into a number of languages. He is the former director of the Arab-Israeli Project at the International Crisis Group, where he spent a decade covering Israel, the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and Israel's relations with its neighbors. Thrall's most recent contributions are The Separate Regimes Delusion and A Day in the Life of Abed Salama. Links to both of these important articles are in the advertisement for this session. Nathan, it's a real pleasure to have you on the program.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. Nathan, let's start with recent developments in Israel and the occupied territories. A good proportion of the available explanations focus on either Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's efforts to retain power in an effort to avoid trial on corruption charges, or otherwise focus on Hamas and its frustration at the cancellation of Palestinian Authority elections by President Mahmoud Abbas. Do you agree with these interpretations, or are these factors the shiny objects, diverting our view from more deep-rooted factors that we should be focusing on?
Thanks for that question, Moin. It's very much the latter. But before I talk about the specific factors involved, I just want to make a broader point, which is obviously none of us have a predictive model. There's nobody out there who can predict when the next uprising or major conflagration is going to take place. So when something happens, we look back and we try and analyze whether it's the truck accident that set off the first Intifada, or Sharon's visit to the Haram al-Sharif that set off the second Intifada. Everybody goes and looks at these proximate causes and largely ignores the real structural and deeper causes. And the fact is that, the power discrepancy is so great that Palestinians just don't have the ability or the energy to sustain uprisings for great lengths of time and with regularity. And so if somebody were truly able to explain these things after the fact, then they should also be able to predict the next one. And no one can do that. No one can say when that's going to happen. In terms of the two main explanations that you gave, I'm very skeptical of this notion that's in the Israeli press of Netanyahu having stirred up things in order to advance his own narrow political interests, namely thwarting the possibility of an alternative government. And not to go too much into the weeds on this, but if you just look at the timeline, it doesn't make any sense. So what were the two, main events that brought about protests over the last month? The first one was the Israeli police closing off the plaza and the steps around Damascus Gate. That took place at the beginning of Ramadan. At that point, Netanyahu had the mandate to form a government. And not only that, he was attempting at that moment to court Mansour Abbas, and he had
one of the Arab parties in the Israeli parliament.
That's right. Sorry for not explaining that. And he had actually opposite interest. He did not have an interest. He already has a very skeptical constituency when it comes to the possibility of cooperation with Palestinian citizens of Israel, and having a conflagration in Jerusalem at that moment was very much against his interest in forming a government. The second major event that led to massive protests that we saw prior to the start of the Gaza war were the forced evictions, the court cases over the forced displacement of Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah. And again, here, this is a years-long process. Those court cases, the dates of them were determined before any kind of coalition calculations could have played a role. The government doesn't determine the date of the court case in any event. And furthermore, what we saw is that the government actually took belated action to try and quell what it saw as a growing uprising. So with the decision to close the steps and the plaza around Damascus Gate, the government capitulated. They eventually, the protests grew so large and were worried about them growing even larger. And they then decided to open up the plaza and reverse their decision, which was an embarrassing move for them. And they did that again while Netanyahu still had the mandate to form a government. And similarly with the Sheikh Jarrah case, the Supreme Court was due to have a hearing on this case on May 10th, which is Jerusalem Day, the ultra-nationalist celebration of Israel's conquest of Jerusalem in 1967. This is when you have a march made up of all kinds of Israelis, but prominently ultra-nationalist, religious Zionist Israelis who march through Damascus Gate and are often chanting Muhammad is a pig, death to Arabs. Palestinian shop owners close their shops. Palestinian residents of the old city where they're marching through hide in their homes. It's a very, very tense event that occurs year after year. And it happened that the court scheduled the Sheikh Jarrah case, one of the hearings that day, and the Attorney General made it so that he recommended that the court postpone that hearing on that day because, again, the government didn't want a major explosion. It was already dealing with a huge rise in protests. So, and at that point, by the way, Netanyahu did have supposedly the incentive because he no longer had the mandate on May 10th, and hoped to thwart the possibility that Yair Lapid would form a government. So on the micro level, even on the micro levels, the explanation of Netanyahu deliberately starting all of this in order to thwart the formation of an alternative government, I think doesn't stand up to scrutiny, and there's very little evidence to support it. I think it stems, by the way, from a larger bias in the press and in the analytic community, which is the bias of liberal Zionism, and that worldview basically attempts to assert that the real problem, the real conflict in Israel-Palestine is a result of the Trump and Netanyahu alliance. If it weren't for Bibi, if it weren't for Trump, then we could have peace. And
none of this would be happening.
Yes, and it's an ahistoric worldview. It's a absolution for the Israeli left of their own culpability in the settlement project, in the Judaization of Jerusalem, in all of the policies that are in place that are the deep causes of the unrest that we see. And so it's part of the system of denial, and to think of yourself as a good liberal when you're part of a regime that is oppressing people based on their ethnicity is to blame it all on the right. There are extremists on both sides. We just need the good guys to come in power, the PA and the liberal Zionist left, and all will be solved. So I see that this analysis stems actually. The false analysis itself has its own deeper cause. And sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to ask if you have similar reservations about the alternate theory, which is that Hamas was outraged that Abbas had canceled Palestinian Authority legislative elections, and then escalated matters deliberately in order to be able to demonstrate their popularity among Palestinian public opinion. That seems to be the kind of alternate explanation that you often see, along with the Netanyahu one we've just discussed.
I mean, I think that the main thing to be said about that is that there was a nascent uprising in place on May 10th when, and well before May 10th, when Hamas made its ultimatum to Israel. And I can tell you, because I live right next to Damascus Gate, I had gone out to many of these protests. I'd seen them. I was fired at with a stun grenade, and I saw that there was enormous support for Hamas in Jerusalem. There were huge crowds chanting for Hamas, chanting for Mohammed Deif, chanting against Abbas. And all of that existed prior to May 10th.
So they didn't need this either.
Well, I mean, you could argue certainly that that factored into their own calculation. I mean, they saw a ripe opportunity. They saw Palestinians were rising up. They saw a mass protest movement. They saw 48 Palestinians were involved. They saw how unpopular Abbas is. So certainly that played into their own calculation of whether the risk was worth it or not. But the phenomenon of the widespread protest that we saw preceded the Hamas decision to present Israel with an ultimatum.
And so you're saying that while these things can't be predicted and we can't really specify it was this and it was not that, if I understand you correctly, you're basically saying if we really want to understand what happened, we need to look at the more deep-rooted factors that brought the situation about in which these events took place.
Yes, absolutely. And you know, those deep factors, they can be exacerbated. It's certainly the case. I don't want to deny that, you know, some of these local conditions helped to bring about what happened now. It's certainly the case that the excessive force used by the police against the Damascus Gate protesters helped to fuel the protests themselves. The huge amount of casualties you had in the days preceding the Gaza escalation on the Haram al-Sharif, that also played a role. So these micro factors, they do play a role, but the deeper causes are the important ones. And the deeper causes are, of course, just the ever-present oppression of Palestinians in Jerusalem and throughout the territory under Israel's control, but also other factors that are maybe more recent, like the weakness of the PA, the weakness of Abbas, the perception that there's no two states or any kind of solution on the horizon, the perception that the Palestinians have been abandoned by the international community and by the Arabs most recently in the Abraham Accords. And I mean, I could list other factors, but I think that the deep causes are really the heart of this uprising, and we saw that in the mouths of the protesters themselves.
Okay, and maybe then turning to our next subject, which is the past few weeks, people have been increasingly speaking about a turning point. That these events collectively represent a turning point. And my question to you is, what was different this time, whether in Israel, whether in Palestine, whether in the region or internationally, to justify such interpretations, and whether or not you agree with them?
So I do have to say that that it really did feel like this Gaza war for sure, and just this last month and a half felt quite different than Jerusalem has felt to me in over 10 years here, and then that Israel-Palestine has felt to me. And so, I want to give a very big caveat before I elaborate on the ways in which I feel it's a turning point, because I think that, if you ask me to predict the future, I believe that we are, decades away from real substantive change here. I believe that, the most likely scenario is that this uprising that we've seen is going to be quashed, that in a few months we're going to be back to a siege on Gaza, Palestine out of the international headlines, Palestinian citizens of Israel back to the relative quiescence that we saw prior to the last few weeks, and security cooperation continuing in the West Bank with Abbas still in place. That is the most likely scenario. There are other possibilities, and so when we talk about a turning point, I don't want to suggest that that the whole world is about to change tomorrow. And I think the way we've seen change in Israel-Palestine has been incremental, and it happens in bursts. And this felt like an important burst. And obviously the turning point is on the U.S. with the discourse in Congress, with members of Congress, and again, don't want to overstate it. Betty McCollum has a bill that she's put forward several times now, calling for, it's not even calling to cut aid to Israel or even condition aid. It's merely looking to examine the U.S. role in the policy of Israeli detention of Palestinian minors. That has zero chance of passing. And so, I want to ground us in the big picture, which is that bill, which is so meek, still has zero chance of passing in this Congress, and only has a small number of signatories to it. That said, the voices that we have heard, first of all, are saying things that we've never heard from members of Congress, and second, these are very important figures. I mean, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is one of the most popular politicians in America, and she is calling Israel an apartheid state. I think that's a very, very significant thing, and I think that there have been other turning points here too. For Hamas, I'm sure this felt like a turning point in terms of its own popularity, and in terms of Abbas's absolute nadir that he's reached. I mean, obviously that's not new. He's been unpopular for a long time, but it really does feel, it's striking how unpopular the Ramallah leadership is right now, and the war, of course, only strengthened that trend. And I think that the most significant thing of all, but for me and for almost everyone I've talked to around me, was what happened inside 48, what happened inside pre-67 Israel.
Do you want to elaborate on that a bit? Because that
Yes.
seems to be what many people I identify as the most significant change these past few weeks.
Yes. Well, first of all, just the very nature of what was happening, where you had the border police, the defense minister calling up the reserves of the border police, where they do most of their work suppressing Palestinians in the West Bank, to call up a large number of reserves to come into cities inside Green Line Israel, to call a curfew, to have checkpoints inside Green Line Israel, to have even basically militia checkpoints. I mean, you had some of these mobs create their own impromptu checkpoints where they were checking cars for the ethnicity of the driver. All of that gave people a glimpse of a very dark future. I mean, I don't think anybody could imagine, Green Line Israel into a Somali-like situation. And now it's imaginable. I don't think it's likely, but it's imaginable, and that was very scary for everyone. Of course, it was extremely scary for Palestinian citizens who were subjected to mob violence, and there was a wonderful op-ed in the Washington Post I believe it was yesterday, describing what it was like to be in Haifa and hide in your house as you had these mobs, the Jewish mobs, roaming through the streets and marking doors of houses for who is an Arab inside. So it was significant just in the sense of a scary possibility. It was significant in the sense that most of the world subscribes to what I call the separate regimes delusion. This belief that there's this hard separation between good Green Line Israel and the bad temporary occupation. And that these two things are totally separate from one another, and the occupation is somewhere over there outside the state of Israel, even though 1 in 10 Israeli Jews live in that area, and even though these places have been fully incorporated and they have fire stations and courthouses and the public health facilities and city halls and all the rest, there is this kind of cognitive dissonance where you understand that these places are essentially Israel on the other side of the Green Line, and yet many Israelis and many in the international community think of it as somehow outside of Israel. And that really disappeared in the last few weeks, because you saw the same conditions, the same border police, the same checkpoints, the same settlers terrorizing Palestinians inside the Green Line. And even, the use of the word settler. I mean, you started to hear much more, it happened before too, but you started to hear much more people describing settlers inside Green Line Israel, because in fact, many of the people who are settling in these so-called mixed cities, who are former residents of the West Bank, Israeli Jewish residents of the West Bank, who moved to Palestinian areas inside Green Line Israel in order to Judaize them. This is the same process happening inside the Green Line and in the West Bank, and I think it was a major blow to those who believe in separate regime and the whole paradigm that goes along with it, of resolving the conflict through a partition into two states with Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. I think all of that was enormously challenged by the last few weeks, and a big part of that challenge was the positive side. I've been describing some of the negative side, but the positive side of what we saw, which was Palestinian unity. And it was striking just how powerful it was to see Palestinians protesting across historic Palestine, and even not just historic Palestine, but coming to the border from Jordan and from Lebanon. Uh, it was, first of all, it was moving. There was something incredibly powerful about seeing Palestinians coming from Jordan to the border as their people were being besieged and bombed and dying, and this kind of effort at what felt like rescue was enormously inspiring. You know, for the first time, you're seeing Palestinians heading in the right direction across that border, or at least attempting to. So I think that just the sight of Palestinian unity was a thing that was frightening to Israelis. I want to tell you a
Because it
small
was so
little anecdote.
visible. Mm. Please. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
I was going to say,
you know,
because it was so visible.
I didn't hear what you just said. Say it again. Sorry.
When you mentioned Palestinian unity making such an impact, I said perhaps because it was so visible on the ground, as you've just described. But
Yes.
I interrupted you. You were giving us an anecdote.
Oh yeah. So I a few years ago I was interviewing a recently retired Israeli general. And I was talking to him about the policy of separation between Gaza and the West Bank that Israel very strictly enforces. And this is part of the policy of the siege of Gaza, and part of Israel's policy, which is to ensure that the standard of living in Gaza never come anywhere close to that of the West Bank, that Palestinians understand that there's a cost to being under Hamas rule, and that they will be punished for elevating Hamas in any way. And I was talking to him about the policy and the kind of deeper rationale for it. And he surprised me because he said, you know, it's not just in a demographic issue that we don't want some large number of the 2 million people in Gaza to move to the West, which we're preventing. We're not allowing Gazans to relocate to the West Bank and live there because we want to, take over what's left of the West Bank, and so we want to minimize the Palestinian population there. Sure, that's part of it, but that's not the main thing. The main thing is the threat of Palestinian unity. And of course, I'd heard, quotes, you see it in the press all the time, where Netanyahu in a Likud meeting talks about how beneficial it is to Israel to have the Palestinians divided, and how they could never, achieve statehood as long as they're divided. And Israel to go for 2 states is much less if Palestinians divided. That we're all familiar with, but what surprised me that the general said that I had never heard before is, the real threat is in Palestinian unity is not Fatah-Hamas unity. It's that Fatah and Hamas, or Gaza and the West Bank, unite, and then Palestinians inside the Green Line unite with them. That's an existential threat to us. And it was at that moment, that was such a distant possibility, such a distant threat, that it was just it was novel to me to have an Israeli say that out loud. And I constantly went back to that quote in my mind over the last couple of years, because I think it's something that's greatly underutilized. The power of that unity,
By the
because
Palestinians.
by the Palestinians, yes, and we got a taste of that power in the last few weeks, and there are enormous obstacles to it being materialized, realized, but it became imaginable in a way that I think is deeply frightening to Israel.
Nathan, well, before asking my next question, given your extensive comments on separate regimes, I'd just like to refer viewers to your article a few months back in the London Review of Books, which is in fact entitled "The Separate Regimes Delusion," and I would very much encourage people to look it up on the website of the London Review of Books. I just before turning back to developments on the ground, I just briefly like to ask your comments on the U.S. role, which is that, as you know, the Biden administration early on made very clear it had other priorities and didn't want to get involved. And now, Secretary of State Blinken is in Jerusalem and Ramallah, seems to be touting an agenda of humanitarian assistance and strengthening the Palestinian Authority in order to seek to weaken Hamas. Um, and perhaps also getting back to your response to my previous question, you now have both Biden and Blinken, at least rhetorically, also talking about equality for citizens within the Green Line, which I think is quite unprecedented. But perhaps briefly, I'd like to get your thoughts on where you see the U.S. role in this question heading.
Yeah. So I think that we should expect nothing good from the Biden administration. The positive trends that I was describing in Congress, that's a very long-term process, and I think that it will be very important, and it's growing, but it's a long-term thing. It's not going to result in Biden surprising us in this term, and even if he has a second term. That's what I mean by long term. I have noticed the use of the word equality, and I welcome it. I don't make too much out of it. I don't think that it signifies a whole lot. I think that both Blinken and Biden are, very traditional in their views as basically, just pro-Israel. A two-state solution, in quotes, is something else we could talk about. But for me, the Trump plan is the real two-state solution. And so I think people make too much of a thing about how horrible the Trump plan is vis-a-vis the real two-state solution. But actually, the Trump plan is the real two-state solution, and there's not so much of a gap between it and what had been proposed and negotiated before. But that's what they want, and they're not going to even work hard to get it, because they have a realistic appraisal of the situation and just how unlikely it is for them to make any progress on that front. And so, we can't expect the Biden administration to reduce aid, to condition aid, to leverage its power and its influence on Israel. So given that, what we really have to hope for is that they will continue to play as little a role as possible. And I've mainly been encouraged by the fact that they have deprioritized the conflict and played a minimal role. That's really the best that we can hope for. I want to say something else just while we're talking about this, the language of equality. You know, there it does feel like many people are now, because there is no hope in any kind of solution, whether two states or something else. People are challenging the old paradigm. They're challenging Oslo. They're challenging the old talking points. They're challenging two states. And by the way, this is another aspect of the power of Palestinian unity, because part of the way in which the international community thinks of the two-state solution as fair is by conceiving of the conflict as primarily over the West Bank and Gaza, as a conflict not between the Palestinian people and Israeli Jews, which is what the conflict really is, but as a conflict between the occupied subjects in the West Bank and Gaza and the state of Israel. And those are two very different things, and they call for very different remedies. And if it's a situation of the state of Israel oppressing the Palestinian people writ large, and it's a conflict with the Palestinian people writ large, then what does the two-state solution look like in that light? It looks like a proposal to take one of the parties, the dominating group, and say, you get to stay united inside your own state, and take the other party, the dominated group, and say, we're going to split you up. You're going to be, you, the united Palestinian people, are going to be divided into, a subjugated minority status inside the state of Israel and into what we will call a state, and probably won't really be a state, in the West Bank and Gaza. So I was saying that in Washington, there is a lot of challenge, or there's a growing challenge to the old model. And one thing that's been cited a lot lately is this Carnegie endowment paper that's calling for the U.S. to adopt a new approach with a rights-based discourse. And I welcome the paper, and I think it's a positive development. But here too, I think that the language is very vague, and it falls far short of what we should be aspiring for. And it's merely hinting and alluding to some other possibility, but when they don't really spell out what they mean by a rights-based approach. And it's rather ironic that when you call for a rights-based approach in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the singular right, the central right, whenever you use the word right in the context of this conflict, what right are we talking about? The right of return, as is the right of all refugees who are expelled in wars. And that's entirely absent from the so-called rights-based approach of the Carnegie paper. So it's so vague. It's really empty, and so is the equality language from the Biden administration. Again, I welcome both developments. I realize change has to happen incrementally, it has to happen slowly. It's in the right direction, but it's far from enough. And even that Carnegie paper, it mentioned the two-state as we're not ruling out two states, and it doesn't anywhere say that we entertain. Spell out what they entertain as an alternative. So the part of your question was about Blinken's visit to Abbas today, and it was obvious to me that during the Gaza war, after it was over, the U.S. would, as a matter of instinct, go and try and help prop up Abbas, and I don't know how much they'll do for him, but even just the very act of going and visiting him is breathing new life into this corpse of the PA. And he, if we want to think about his own incentives, I mean, he was really in a corner, totally at a nadir in his influence. He's watching the Gaza war as a bystander. He's watching the protests in Jerusalem as a bystander. He's being denounced by these protesters in Jerusalem in huge numbers on the Haram al-Sharif, thousands chanting against him. Last Friday, the PA-affiliated Mufti chanted out. So, this might be a moment where he would be forced to make some kind of compromise. And the U.S. coming in and patting him on the back and hugging him and telling him we're gonna bring things back to what they used to be. It only prolongs something that needs to come to an end already.
Thanks, Nathan. Perhaps to conclude our discussion, and I think a lot of what we've been talking about so far has focused very much on what you term the separate regimes delusion, and how that's a delusion not only in theory, as you've published in articles before the recent events, but now how also on the ground it's been directly contradicted. So, what I'd like to ask you to do in conclusion, is perhaps looking forward, as you reflect on recent developments. How do you see them playing out? Are there perhaps any specific ideas or proposals that have come into your head watching developments in recent weeks that you think could have a constructive impact on what may be happening in the coming weeks and months?
Yes. So I think I've thought two main things over the recent weeks. One is something that's familiar, and I had thought before these recent events, is that the largest obstacle to having a true paradigm shift in the international community, we're starting to see it, but the real obstacle, the biggest obstacle to it today, is the PLO, is the PA. And everyone in DC, everyone in Europe, Blinken and Biden and all of them, you can come to them and say that this is a conflict in which the Palestinian people are one, in which the Palestinian people are being dominated through various means in these various areas. You can argue till you're blue in the face that their old paradigm is dead. But as long as they can point to the PA and the PLO and say the only legitimate representatives, the leadership of the Palestinian national movement, they're still with my paradigm. They still say what I say. And what that also means is that there could be a rapid change if pressure could be brought to bear on that leadership, or if that leadership were to change, because that's really the kind of the last obstacle to what we're already seeing happening despite that obstacle. And I recall being at a meeting of the PLO in Ramallah a couple of years ago, and the main EU representative got up and he said to several leaders of Fatah who were there, he said, don't keep blaming us, as they were doing in their remarks that day. Don't keep blaming us, Europe, or the international community for the positions that you are taking, that you have to be saying we support a Palestinian state on 67 borders and so on and so forth, because we'll lose Europe if we don't, or we'll lose the international community if we don't. If you tomorrow say we've changed our goals, and we want to have full rights, and we want to re-examine the entire regime that is in power from the river to the sea, because there is just one regime in power, we'll be with you, because at the end of the day, we are in favor of basic things like equality. Now, you can rightly be skeptical that they will be with you, but it really is the case that that would be an enormous accelerant if PA were to change its tune. The more important thing that I thought is really when you got this glimpse of Palestinian unity over the past few weeks. It made me start to imagine new possibilities. You know, what if at some point in the future, the Palestinian people were to form a body that included either the elected members of Knesset or the High Follow-Up Committee, the representatives of pre-67 Israel, Palestinian citizens inside Israel, and it included Palestinians from the diaspora and representatives from Gaza and representatives from Jerusalem and representatives from the West Bank. And this body were to say to Israel, we are the address for any matter of Palestinian concern. You want to talk to us about security cooperation in the West Bank? You want to talk to us about protests in Jerusalem? You want to talk to us about violence in cities inside pre-67 Israel? You want to talk to us about soldiers or the bodies of soldiers that are held in Gaza? All of these things come to this address, and we will make trade-offs. We will decide whether we want to negotiate continued security cooperation against, relaxation of the siege in Gaza, or against recognition of unrecognized villages either in Area C or in the Negev. And I think that it would be enormously empowering for Palestinians if they were able to do that. And secondly, I think it would have a huge impact on the international perception of what this conflict is, because suddenly it would be undeniable to the whole world that this is a conflict between Israel, between Israeli Jews, really, and the Palestinian people. And the Palestinian people, and they're being dominated in various ways. And that is the issue that we need to address and we need to correct. And it won't be corrected with our old models.
Nathan, thank you very much for this fascinating discussion and your insights into the context and implications of what we've seen in recent weeks. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, everyone, for joining us on this latest episode of Connections.
Thank you for having me, Mouin.
Are we off?